I want to emphasize that China is confident to cope with any acts of trade and investment protectionism. The U.S. behavior starts a very abominable precedent, as the tariff on Chinese products openly violates the World Trade Organization's regulations. The abandoning of the multilateral trading system tramples the multilateral rules. The U.S.'s disgusting conduct may trigger a chain reaction of trade protectionism and cast a shade over the revived global economy.
They're the two largest economies in the world, and they're not afraid to go head-to-head. Last month, Donald Trump said he wanted to raise duties on steel and aluminium imports. And while several countries were exempt, one that wasn't was China. And they're not impressed. Not a nation to take things lying down. Beijing hit back with their own tariffs on 128 U.S. imports, including pork and wine. And it's already hurting the American economy after U.S. stocks made their worst start to a second quarter since the Great Depression. So are we on the verge of a full-blown trade war? And if so, who is to blame? Well, let's ask the experts. Joining us from Singapore is Alex Capri. He's a senior fellow at the Asian Trade Center. And in Washington, D.C. is Sourabh Gupta. He's a senior analyst at the Institute for China-America Studies. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us. Alex, the two biggest economies in the world engaging in tit-for-tat trade actions, recoiling into protectionism. It seems to be bad news for everyone. So why on earth did Trump start it?
Well, look, this is in line with the political platform that Donald Trump ran on. It's also in line with the ideology that is consistent with his team of trade advisors, which is an ideology of economic nationalism. It's an ideology that views trade as a very zero-sum game. And it's, some would say a fairly blunt instrument when it comes to engaging other countries. It's also an ideology that favors bilateral deals and bilateralism and actually frowns upon and rejects multilateralism. So it is consistent with both the ideology and the political platform that Mr. Trump ran on. It is, of course, running contrary to what the better part of the world is now aligned with, which is a multilateralism, the mega trade deals and free trade agreements that involve numerous countries. So, again, it's causing a lot of problems.
Right. So, Sourabh, Beijing retaliated. It's become tit for tat. Should Beijing have been a bit better than that and not got sucked into this game?
Yeah, it's important to understand when to retaliate and when not to retaliate, and the proportion of retaliation. I think Beijing has called it correct on this occasion. One should not retaliate if there might be a legitimate case to be brought against Beijing by the U.S., and the U.S. should do that at the WTO. The U.S. has the grounds on which President Trump has imposed his steel and aluminum tariffs are very, very flimsy. If there is not retaliation against that, and mind you, this retaliation, I wouldn't call it immediate retaliation. Beijing asked for consultations with the U.S. with regard to making compensation for the tariffs that were being imposed. And that is a means that is perfectly valid within the multilateral trading system.
Right.
The U.S. turned around and said that it does not want to engage in that conversation, and therefore Beijing laid out that list. That list is proportional to the amount of tariffs, to the amount of losses that Beijing is going to suffer. So I think actually it's important to retaliate, because if one just turns one's cheek, one is going to get slapped again. And what we have coming down the line on the Section 301 investigation on China's IPR practices might be much, much more severe than what we have seen on the steel front. And therefore, I think it's important just to have a shot across the bow to let everybody know that how serious matters can devolve to.
So, Alex, how likely is it that this will escalate into a full-blown trade war? And what would that mean?
Well, I think if this is mismanaged, I think if, for example, there isn't a period of perhaps consultation between Washington and Beijing, perhaps some coming to the table to negotiate, which by the way, many people would say that if you look at Trump's behavior, for example, with the tariffs on steel and aluminum, after the very bombastic announcements, after the tweets and the publicity, he's actually walked back a fair amount of those. So a number of those countries, a number of major trading partners of the United States have received exemptions, right? The EU, South Korea, Mexico, Canada. So some would say that the purpose of this Section 301 investigation may be to get Beijing to the negotiating table. And there certainly are very, very fundamental systemic behavioral patterns that China Inc., if you like, has engaged in over the years, which have not, in fact, exhibited fair trade practices. So to answer the question, could this escalate into more tit for tat and more retaliation? Yes, it could. But it's possible also that we might actually see negotiations, and we may actually see some positive developments come out of this.
Right. So, Sourabh, when you basically have, I don't know, Ali and Foreman fighting, you know, who's going to officiate this thing? Who's going to kind of be the referee? Who's going to get into the ring to push these people apart? Is it the World Trade Organization, and how impactful can they be?
It must be the World Trade Organization's dispute settlement body. It is perhaps the crown jewel of the multilateral trading system, and this is the one avenue, the one venue at which many of these problems can be resolved. Even if the two countries go tit for tat against each other, but then are amenable to going through that dispute settlement body process, I think much can be salvaged. My real great fear is that on the impending tariffs which are going to come following the Section 301 IPR investigation of China's IPR practices, President Trump has already put out a memo. The list of items on which the tariffs are going to be placed are about to be announced. But I mean, let's also just hang back a little bit out here. It's after that's announced, there's going to be a 30-day public comment period. So nothing's happening right away. We have at least a 30 or a 60-day cooling off period during which time the two parties can talk. But my real anxiety is that the U.S. does not really, with regard to the IPR case, and it is planning to impose tariffs of up to $50 billion, the U.S. says that this is not an issue which is resolvable by the WTO's dispute settlement body. Just one of 4 elements in its investigation of China's IPR practices, it says, is amenable to a settlement at the WTO's dispute settlement body. Okay. The rest of it cannot be settled and probably will just have to be dealt with by unilateral means. And when it comes down to unilateralism, it's going to be, that's the time I think things are really going to get very serious, because it's $50 billion worth of retaliation is different from, you know, the steel retaliation steel and aluminium we're talking about is maximum $3 billion. Yeah.
Okay,
we're talking much larger sums and on the basis of unilateralism.
Okay, Sourabh, Alex, I've got to wrap, unfortunately, but a lot of people watching this thinking, you know, how does this impact me practically? How is this going to affect me? And we're going to try and tease that out over the coming weeks and months and follow the story closely. For the moment, I'm going to thank both of you, Alex and Sourabh. Thanks for joining us here on the Newsmakers.